Could you help us understand what is kind of this classic idea of a social program?
So the way that I describe social impact or social programs is when you think about what is the impact that's having on an individual or on a community, even in the behavior change, as you think of the co-benefits of E and S, social is really in a change in a person, in an organization. It could potentially be amongst an animal welfare type program. But when you think about the impact that's being made outside of the direct impact on the environment, that's the social implications of what a program and how it's compiled. So when we look at an individual organization, they're made up of many social programs within. So it's not just one big organization and one mission statement and that's it, but instead the way that we approach the social of it all is looking at the individual programs that are helping them to achieve outcomes within the community. So again, could be on an individual, organization, an animal, or an overall structure or policy.
And because that is so, I guess, broad in scope,
Yes.
has there historically been a one-stop shop or a location where, let's say, if I as an individual, or maybe I'm representing the sustainability program in my company, has there historically been one place for people to go see all of the different social impact programs out there?
There are no standards on social programs to date. So beyond what we've created through Impact Genome's impact standards, there have not been this standard body or registry. And in order to actually understand what's happening or how have we been doing, when you think about the SDGs, you can think about all of these beautiful, colorful squared tiles, but you can't think of an individual organization in a CSR type role or an individual foundation that could be working within a community or in the public space or even private. They're never going to be able to achieve an individual SDG. SDGs are determined based on population statistics in most cases. So when you think about how do we understand, well, what is actually happening, we need a standard common language in order to be able to communicate what are the outcomes being achieved. And so to date, that's why the Impact Genome Registry exists. We actually started as consultants ourselves. So as consultants, we were evaluating and reviewing social impact programs for funders, and we kept evaluating the same programs over and over again because this organization wanted to hear it in this way. This organization had a slightly different nuance in terms of how they approach it. But when it comes down to it, that organization, in terms of the impact producer, the charity who's creating the outcomes, they were not creating different outcomes. They had the same outcomes that were being created. And so what we realized was there's an opportunity to create this central registry or depository of social impact, but help it be this organic body that we can continue to learn from it. So it's not just verifying a social impact program, but it's actually going beyond and figuring out what works. If we want to solve the housing crisis, let's look at the outcomes that are being achieved, but let's also look at, well, what creates an outcome and what makes a program successful. And now that we have that common language, we can benchmark and compare in order to figure out what is it that's happening and how is it that we can shift the world to funding programs like this.
Which definitely makes sense. And I don't want to downplay how complex it is on the environmental side to measure success. But if you take something like emissions reporting or water conservation, it feels like it can be a little bit easier, quote unquote, to standardize and to find those metrics. As someone who works in emissions reporting, it is not that easy. However, I can imagine it's even more complex, as you were saying, of it, since there haven't historically had these standards. So what would maybe some examples of those metrics look like? And is this something new in terms of the standardization? Just to give our listeners a bit of an idea as to what success could look like and how you would measure that.
Right. I oftentimes hear from people, isn't it really hard to report and verify social impact? And I think about your world and I think if we can report on the ozone layer, surely
Yeah.
there's complicated things. And looking at programs like social emotional learning skill development or support to young people who are beginning their journey within the academic world and becoming prepared for college or post-secondary school. There are specific outcomes that we can identify that are being achieved, and we can understand, what's connected in order to create our ultimate goal. But in order to get to that ultimate goal, we need to know what needs to be happening along the way. So when you think about what's possible and how difficult is it, or is it going to be possible into the future, thinking more long term, because what we've done, so to create our standard, we essentially gathered tens of thousands of articles of evidence from the academic space and any type of literature that we could get our hands on, and we physically hand coded it to understand what outcomes are being achieved. And because we know, and you would know this in the environmental space, you know, in the academic world and then in seeing it in practice, there isn't necessarily always that direct connection or agreement. So what we said was we need to create a system or a standard that's peer reviewed, but also based within evidence. So we created that evidence base and inputted it into our registry. And then from there, we created a peer review board to actually go to practitioners and say, you're an expert in housing, you're an expert when it comes to mental health supports for young people, etc. Tell us, does this academic research in terms of how they're reviewing it and refining it to actually communicate those outcomes, does this make sense to you? Is this how you would apply it? So that's how we initially began that journey of creating an organic standard. And I call it organic because it's continuing to grow. This does not mean that we were created in 2017. We don't stop there, but instead we continue to build in that registry. And what also happens is we now have this third entry of data points or validation in our verification process because we have the academic research, we have our peer review board, and then the third point of data that's coming in is directly from the organizations that are being verified themselves. So now what we have is this constant feedback loop to hear from them directly. Well, Lauren, right now your outcomes in housing are X, Y, and Z. I don't see myself in this. Either help me understand how I'm applying to these outcomes, or I'm actually creating a new outcome. And so what we would call that is an emerging outcome. And as soon as we get enough feedback from other organizations who are equally calling that out, well, then maybe perhaps we're establishing a new outcome that's being determined and a new standard that can then be reported on. So it's really this organic body that continues to grow. And what's really powerful in that is the outcomes that are being achieved, they're being communicated. But what also comes forward are the actual interventions, or what we would call a core component. So what are the activities that need to happen in order for these outcomes to be achieved? Many programs are taking different approaches, so we've standardized those as well. And why that's really powerful and important is we can actually look to what outcomes are being achieved within benchmarks and then say, well, we're seeing trends. Programs that are successful and have a high efficacy rate and are within benchmark in terms of the cost per outcome, they oftentimes have these two core components. And so now what we can say within those trends is, okay, well, if the government is about to dish out a whole lot of money towards housing, and we know what makes a program successful, well, then let's ensure that programs that are going to receive that funding have those core components, because then essentially what we're doing is we're forecasting and de-risking the investment that we as the public are making through the government funds.